Dale, we're interested in getting a little bit clearer idea of the timeline of rollout of the changes, and specifically as they're related to getting some of these officers upgraded on their training to be a part of this new team.
Right, and it's a great question. And so the first meeting was yesterday. They brought everybody together. We had 30-some people. It's going to start immediately. We're going to start training. I mean, I think you got to start with, first of all, looking at all the similarities and realize that this is a team. So you're not training CERM officers to be police officers or highway traffic officers to be police officers. The reality is the similarities is they all have red and blue lights. They all have provincial authority. The use of force model, the arrest and control techniques are very similar. This isn't about that. I mean, this is about actually what can we do to enhance those services. So, CERM stops people on the highway. Car blast by, drunk driver, somebody traveling at high rates of speed. Now they'll have some additional training and authority. They can stop that vehicle. The whole point is let's increase the visibility. If we have these officers working as a team, so if you look 3 days ago, CERM and the RCMP combined to do a bootlegging project going into northern Saskatchewan. A lot of these frontline relationships are working now. This is just to formalize a team, use the strengths, use what we have collectively together, and what deficiencies we have, let's train. So the ones that'll take the longest, obviously, the highway traffic officers. They're not armed, so. That isn't about how quick can we get them armed. Let's get that correct. It's about arming them properly and training them properly. And the time that takes is the time that takes. But we have a police college. We do that. We do that now. We've trained many different groups in firearms, including the sheriffs. So it isn't so much about how quick we can do it. It's about doing it right. But I think a lot of it can go quickly. So when you look at CERM and you look at police officers, the authorities are pretty much the same. There's a lot of things. The training is very similar. It's just a tweak and making sure that they're working together and they know what their responsibility are and putting them all under one governance structure so that we're doing it collectively together. So now you have a formalized backup. You have a formalized, if some person in rural Saskatchewan has somebody prowling through their yard, and if we have a car that's a mile away or whatever it is, let's send the closest car. Let's not phone the RCMP, which could be a ways away, and say it's going to take, let's use 30 minutes, a half hour, an hour. They're not going to be there. So it's to provide all those things, and I really want to focus on that, because visibility is the biggest deterrent of crime. It's also the biggest thing to deal with perception of crime. We've done that. Drug interdiction. Think about drug interdiction. How does drugs pass or travel in Saskatchewan? They travel on the roads. They're not flying in big shipments, or even if they do fly in big shipments, then they go to the roads. So now we have an increased presence. So train them in pipeline means drug interdiction. We'll train them all in that, because now we're looking for the things that are destroying our communities, the things that are driving the property crime, and then we're getting in front of that. Think about traffic fatalities and accidents with injuries. 2 years ago when we started the initial CTSS, deaths per 100,000 were 17.2, homicides were 4. Where are we losing more young people, more kids, more of our community? We're going to have a bigger presence on our roads. So that doesn't, right now, even in the south, in the southern region, looking at the data, we've dropped that 17.2 to 12% in 2 years. That's a significant return, not only to the people. Obviously, it's a huge cost saver, for SGI, but it's just about getting the right resources at the right time to enhance and use the best value of what we have. And it's a pretty strong plan when you actually put it all together.
With the timeline of training the officers, though, is that something that the highways guys, for example, is that starting right away?
We will start it as soon as possible. Obviously, when you train somebody with firearms, you got to go through a screening process. You got to do all the things right. It's not to weed people out. It's just to make sure that they're the right fit for the job. So they still have their own mandates. Let's be clear on that. Highway still has a mandate that's going to be separate from the police, and that's important, and nobody's going to take away from that. CERM has still got, they're dealing with, obviously, dangerous hunters. They're dealing with a whole bunch of other things in relation to the land. They still have those duties. But this is now formalizing a team that they'll assist each other, and they'll move, and they can help each other, and they can be on the roads. It'll increase our presence in rural Saskatchewan. It'll increase the working community between the municipal police services, the RCMP, and CERM. It's basically a great step to look at what it's going to look like to making sure that we're working as one unit in this province.
Have you heard how some of those workers feel about taking on additional responsibilities?
From the working team that I got briefed on yesterday, very well. I mean, I think everybody clearly knows that we're not jumping into it without the appropriate training. And I would say in large cases, as a former chief of police, and I'll just speak exclusively to the one with CERM and policing, a lot of those relationships exist now. So we're basically formalizing what's happened on the front lines and giving them some support to making sure that it's enhanced.
Do you know specifically how much money is associated with training, especially with firearms training? Is that more costly? Or?
You know, I mean, it's all put into the budget. I couldn't break it out exclusively. I certainly could get you that number, but what I do know is there's enough budget in there to do it. And you know, and I want to reiterate too is this isn't about how quick or how much money is. It's about training them properly, so we're not putting the officer safety at jeopardy. And nobody's expecting them to go in like a police officer and hold the file and do that stuff. All of these officers now, including police, let's say it's, let's just pick an incident, it's a firearms, whether it's CERM or it's the RCMP in rural Saskatchewan, every officer approaches that the same way. If it's not safe to go in, even if you're a police officer, you wait for your backup. If it's safe to go in and you can go in, you're going to go in because you're going to alleviate the situation. But those are the mechanisms that you make choices on based on your training, right? So nobody's looking at these folks to do anything that they're not trained for or anything that is going to put them in harm's way.
The $5.9 million budget, I mean, how did that figure come about? And
well, CTSS, if you remember, we did this a couple of years ago. We started a 60-person CTS, which is Combined Traffic Safety Services. So we started to do this now, mixing municipal police officers and the RCMP. And so we had that as an evaluation of what it cost. We know through the evaluation that SGI did of what the cost savings were as a result of that, and this was actually them putting a further investment to expand this across the province. So rather than 60, we will now have 120. And we've already seen what the 60 have done to reduce the numbers. We've already seen what the 60 have done to reduce the number of complaints through visibility in the rural areas, and we're expanding that, and then we're adding and layering on the other two mechanisms that we have as provincial authorities in CERM and highways. So obviously this is a significant increase in visibility for us.
is there any feeling amongst those that are being asked to take on additional responsibilities that they should be compensated more for doing more or different types of work?
You know, that hasn't been mentioned to me yet, and you know, I just want to talk about that for a second. Is for the most part, they're doing this work now, and I just want to reiterate that. I mean, compensation is not what I decide on. What I can have control of is basically making sure that the training is there, the appropriate training. I know there is a desire in most cases to move in this direction. I heard that yesterday's meeting was very enthusiastic, very much one team, which is a theme of the government. And I mean, it's important for us to enable that to happen. So, you know, some of these things, you know, what are those questions going to be later on? I'm sure those questions will get asked, but that's not the purpose of this.
FSAN Vice Chief Heather Bear said earlier this week she feels, and the FSAN feels, that this isn't the best way to tackle some of these issues, and that it could end up with more Indigenous people incarcerated. So what's your response to that?
Well, I mean, you know, I have a lot of respect, as you know, I'm Métis as well, and you know, I have a lot of respect for Heather Bear, and I've been a chief in Prince Albert for just about 10 years, and you know, I do not think that is the case, and certainly that's not the intended case. But you know, that talks about, let's talk about the encompassing strategy now. So, you know, first and foremost, we need to work with First Nations on an Aboriginal gang strategy led by First Nations. That's in the plan. That's something we've been working on with Straight Up. FSAN has one. We're working with the federal government to make sure that's an off-ramp to get out of the justice system. Let's talk about the hubs. There's 16 hubs in Saskatchewan right now. There's 100 of them in Canada and in the US, all originated out of Prince Albert. We're putting more of those into First Nations communities. So right now, Muscadet, Achapaways, there's Isla Cross, which is a Métis community, but we're looking at that as well. So, I mean, what is that? That's getting it before it happens. That's the root causes. And she's exactly right, but I would say it's right in the fact that we need to balance it. You can't do one without the other. People need to understand that. You know, nobody is responding to a call response based on somebody's, because we're talking about emergency response based on ethnicity, they're responding based on behavior. And it's important to distinguish that. And so that's what the hubs are designed to do. If you go further down the line, that we're building 4 new PAC teams. That's a police officer and a mental health worker in a police car to get people connected to mental health quicker. We've had those right now in Saskatoon and Regina, and they're showing significant positive results in getting people connected to resources and what they need for treatment quicker, and it's reducing numbers in emergency rooms in some of those communities. So, and that's a partnership between health and policing. So we're going to expand that into 4 smaller communities. And we're looking at tech-enabled hubs with the Department of Defense. What is a tech-enabled hub? How can we have a tech table or a hub table in a small and remote community, whether it's rural Saskatchewan, whether it's northern Saskatchewan? We're close to having that developed. Again, part of the strategy. So we're adding a scan unit to Prince Albert in northern Saskatchewan. That's those houses that are involved in drugs, and that's different authorities from the police to ensure that we're dealing with those small and remote communities and some of the problems they have in a non-traditional law way. So when you look at this, and there's more, there's a CFSU increase. We're going to put more people to deal with fentanyl and meth. You know, if you look at it from a police perspective, there's a large association usually with property crime and increased crystal meth usage. What's the intelligence on crystal meth in Saskatchewan right now? It's increasing. Again, comprehensive strategy. This is the problem, and this is the thing that I would take a bit of exception with any of the comments when we just isolate on one specific part of the plan. In isolation, it won't work. But putting it all together and putting all the players on the table and start to work for the same common outcome and the same goal, evidence-based outcomes, it works. And there's lots of science around it. And everything that we've expanded right now has proof of working. We're not starting something brand new. They've all been proven to work and show results. But now we're putting it into one plan. And I think, you know, will it need tweaking? Is it perfect? Absolutely not. Will it need tweaking? You bet it will. But we got to start addressing our crime rate because it's been the highest in the country for a long time. We're losing young people. We got to address our impaired driving in our roads because you know what? We're losing people disproportionately faster than any province in this country. That is what we should be taking exception to. You know, it's not okay for a person in rural Saskatchewan not to feel safe. It's no different than the city. We have to take exception to that. We've looked at all those things and we feel we've got a start of a good plan. Is it finished? No. Will we need to keep monitoring? Is it a living plan? Absolutely.
Will you measure success by seeing the crime rate go down?
Crime rate is one way. You know, it's not always about crime rate, as you know, because rural Saskatchewan right now, crime rate is actually down. But when you look at pockets of rural Saskatchewan, it's increased. And there's reasons why those pockets. So it's to look at making sure that you've got the input of the community to making sure that they feel safe as much as it is the crime. So one thing we've also talked about is the PTR is going to be governed differently. It's going to be governed like the CFSU. There'll be the police, the SGI, the CERM leaders that will all have a sit on the governance table. But there's also built-in advisory panel. That advisory panel will meet once or twice a year. That will include invitations to SUMA, to SARM. You know, important that we have them at the table. It's the FSIN. Maybe it's Mothers Against Drinking and Driving. You know, the Métis Nation. We need to be hearing from those communities on a regular basis. We shouldn't have to, we need a formal mechanism to channel those complaints so the officers know what they're dealing with, both real and perceived, and that is also built into this plan.
Are there other areas that have done this type of a team?
Pockets of it, you know, so BC has pockets of it. They have their own. Alberta has just a highway traffic branch. We've looked at everything we had, including the CSOs, which is another thing. We're having extreme success in CSOs in North Battleford and Prince Albert. We're going to give the communities the ability to regionalize, to build their own CSO programs, and we're going to support those. So, I mean, we're going to give police services the ability to regionalize in relation if the rural municipality and if the rural municipality and the city want to combine, we're going to ensure that the mechanisms are in place for them to do that if they're going to be more effective. So it has a large part of getting the community more involved and obviously getting that early information from the community to help shape how we can get this done on the ground.
Just getting back to the FSIN piece briefly, is there anything that could be done going forward? Is that part of trying to do a better job of bringing these two groups to be more in line if they're feeling like this isn't what we want to do?
Well, I mean, we always have to be communicating with all of our partners, FSN or certainly that. But on a whole other file that's not part of this, we're currently right now working with First Nations leadership and the federal government to rebuild and redesign First Nations policing. It needs change. A, it's not funded adequately, and B, it needs change. But our federal partners, as you know, are the majority players in that. We're working collectively with all sides of that to get what's best for Saskatchewan, and that's another file that we're also pushing forward on. But I don't want to confuse that with this, although they will be linked.